Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Geoff Dubrow.
And welcome to Politics and Public Finance. I'm Geoff Dubrow. One of the mystifying parts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, no, not the special operation, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that it is hard for Westerners to understand why Vladimir Putin supposedly remains popular at home despite a catastrophic war in Ukraine that Russians did not ask for. Thousands dead on both sides, unprecedented sanctions against Russia do not seem to have affected his popularity ratings at home. Western media has at times portrayed the Russian people as simply pawns in a propaganda war, where they are existing in a propaganda bubble with the majority of the older population not exposed to anything but official news sources. At the same time, those that are in the know, for example, those with a VPN who can access real news, are constrained by law adopted by Putin's rubber stamp parliament, the Duma, which imprisons Russians for up to 15 years just for mentioning the word war. As a result, I want to explore these factors as well as how they might be affecting or perpetuating Vladimir Putin's popularity at home. My guest today is Geoff Sahadeo of the Institute of European, Russian, and European Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. Professor Sahadeo, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Thanks for having me, Geoff.
And since I've known you for a long time, I think I'm going to call you Geoff, if that's okay.
That's fine.
That's great. So, Geoff, let's start with, why do you attribute Putin's popularity in Russia, his ongoing popularity, or to what do you attribute it, despite the catastrophic war he has initiated in Ukraine?
And I think Putin, over the last 2 decades, has built up this strong identification of him with the Russian nation and the Russian state. And this has remained solid, and in fact has gone up every time Putin has fought a conflict. It started in Chechnya, then on to Georgia, and then on to Crimea in 2014. I remember when Putin was first appointed as prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, and we thought he was just another in the line of faceless nomenclature or bureaucrats. But he started the war in Chechnya, and that really became his calling card. He talked harsh, he talked in very dehumanizing terms about Chechens. He managed to successfully prosecute the war, and then got lucky, and the oil prices rose, so the Russian economy, which had been starved during the 1990s, all of a sudden was in a better shape. So he was able to take advantage of this combination of being the patron of the military, and then having the economy grow, starting to pay pensions on time, all of these things that were humiliating Russia in the 1990s. And he became the person that brought Russia out of that post-Soviet humiliation. And I think that still resonates. And what's interesting is it resonates even for young people. This sort of nostalgia for a great power that they don't even know, but they feel. And part of this is what they've been told in school, on television, through social media even, that Russia deserves a better place in the world and that the West is out to get Russia. And I think that narrative has really permeated quite deeply. It doesn't automatically translate into support for the war, but it's something that we can draw on, and he has drawn on pretty effectively.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, and I'm in a way I feel badly that truth is staring us in the face. Having worked in Russia for many years, and I know, of course, you've spent much time there as well. I worked there when there was still a hope for democracy from 1999 to 2004. But I was exposed to a Russian view of the world, which I would characterize as chauvinistic towards other countries, including Ukraine. Have you observed this as well in your work, and how prevalent do you think it is? And could this be a factor in maintaining the support for the war?
I do think that there's a couple of things that are going on there. So yeah, the Russians have a much more pessimistic view of the outside world, and that can trail into chauvinism sometimes. So the line between patriotism and chauvinism is a little bit gray, but I think when you see Russians being asked questions about not just are they patriotic, but would they support Russia's interests even if it harmed other nations? and they'll be much more likely to say yes than those of Western countries. So there's this belief, and Putin again has captured this very well, that there is this struggle, and of course, Russians have been taught in school, and older people have experienced or remember the effects of the Second World War, the early Cold War, when there were shortages and privation, and of course the sense of impending nuclear war, which was there as well as here, too. And so this belief that Russia is a special people that the West wants to crush, and also this sense that under the Soviet period, Russia was a rightful ruler of the Soviet Union and was this older brother. I mean, this official doctrine of friendship of peoples, which could sometimes be benign, but it always talked about Russia as having this mastery of all the peoples. And if the Ukrainians want to dance in their little costumes, that's fine. If the Kyrgyz want to cook their national food, that's okay. But the Russians are inherently the superior people in that part of the world. And for anyone to challenge that is an existential threat to their existence. They cannot really see themselves as being anything but this dominant nation in Eurasia.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. And I think this podcast, the Politics and Public Finance podcast, is still relatively new and still taking shape. And I think one of the things that I find interesting is to be able to delve into issues where I think the media is not necessarily capturing the whole picture. And I think that's very much the case here, because there's the propaganda bubble that we've talked about, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Then there's the issue of of chauvinism and how that Russians may be predisposed to supporting aggression abroad, even if it hurts others. And then there's, for example, the recent interview on Power and Politics with former Deputy Minister of Energy for Russia, Vladimir Milos, who is now in Lithuania and no longer a friend of the regime, who said that despite Putin's high popularity rating in recent polling, this should be taken with a huge grain of salt, implying that most Russians are not yet aware of events in Ukraine. And suggesting that if they became more aware of the events in Ukraine, I would hope they would be taking advantage of, taking heed of not only the war crimes being committed or alleged war crimes being committed by Russia, as well as the number of deaths, but I imagine they would also be interested in the deaths of their own soldiers. To what extent do you think this is a factor? He was implying that once the Russian deaths in Afghanistan started to become more or the Russian population became more knowledgeable about those, that changed the public opinion in Russia. What do you think about that? How likely is that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Russians who want to know what's going on, really want to know what's going on, can figure out a way to find out. I mean, there's lots of streams of communication. Ukraine has done a pretty decent job to the extent that they can of publicizing all of these things that have been going on in Russia. And you have Ukrainians calling their Russian relatives and telling them, look, you can hear the bombs around us, right? This is what's happening. And then there are a lot of Russians who just don't want to know what's going on. But I would say there's also probably the most significant group are the Russians who have an idea of what's going on, but they are taken in by the narrative that the Kremlin and broader society, and I talk about broader society, I mean like television, talk shows, radio, even just some of these patriotic groups and things like that Putin has supported, that the Russians, first of all, they had to do this. They were being forced because Ukraine was about to fall into Western hands. They believe this narrative that Ukrainians have been bombing civilians in the Donbass since 2014. They believe that there are Nazis in Ukraine, maybe not all in the government, but they believe there are significant Nazi forces. And it's a different media universe that they live in a different truth universe that we live in. And I mean, we shouldn't be that surprised, in a sense. More than half of members of the Republican Party, or half of people identify with the Republican Party in the United States, believe that Trump won the election in 2020, right? Despite all the news that we have, despite all the in an open and free society. So how do we expect the Russians in not an open and free society, one that's very closed, to actually come up with a narrative that's quite independent of what their leaders are telling them, or what their political predilections are telling them. And go back to our first discussion about sort of this chauvinism, patriotism edging into chauvinism. Now, it's quite possible. I would say that unlike Crimea in 2014, when you saw these massive celebrations and this really this enthusiastic outpouring of support, you don't see that. You also do see a lot of the Russians who have opposed the war leaving, tens of thousands of important tech workers. I mean, Putin might not care about them for now because they're not his support base, but they do play an important role in the Russian economy.
And there are people who are free to now to criticize the government from outside Russia. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit tougher for them, right? Because if they criticize the government from Tbilisi or Helsinki and they have family members in Russia, then that's also something you have to keep in mind. But you do have those people out there. The sanctions are taking some kind of bite. Now, sanctions are a double-edged sword, right? The initial narrative that Putin can spin is, well, this is just more evidence that the West is out to get us, and I think that can happen. But over the longer term, given that Putin has tied his fortunes to economic prosperity, if the economy continues to slip for a while, the deaths continue to mount. It took years and years in Afghanistan for this to have an effect, right? So I think that would be a longer term thing. I think if public support for the war in Russia is going to erode, we're talking many months, if not years, and it's unclear how long the war would go on. So I don't think Putin is too worried about that right now, because he knows that as long as he keeps the narratives going and the mythology going, the talk show hosts going, and can broadcast an occasional victory or two, he can win support. But there was this one snippet of news that came out that the U.S. intelligence had caught, this idea that by May 9th, Putin wanted to have some kind of triumph. Because I think maybe there is that worry that if he gets to May 9th and nothing has happened, and it's already been a few months, then things could start to get dicey. So it's not a short-term worry for him, but I'm sure it's in the back of his mind.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of really interesting points. One I wasn't going to raise necessarily, but the U.S. and Russia, both former empires, for lack of a better term, I have noticed similarities in terms of the patriotism that is ingrained in a very young age, in both. As you know, Jeff, in Canada, we don't stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag every morning. It really is very different, a really different outlook. So I think you have a really good point there about whether having sort of patriotism ingrained in you from a young age makes you predisposed to supporting conflicts similar to how there was such support in the U.S. for Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I was living in the U.S. during that time, actually, in Tennessee, as a matter of fact. And I remember when 9/11 first happened, there was a question, a real confusion about what went on. But the minute the military went in, so it's not just it's a military patriotic culture, this idea that we support our troops no matter what. And through Afghanistan, through Iraq, now obviously in the U.S. it's an open society, and there were more critical voices. And Abu Ghraib was a large scandal, but it didn't alter the basic tenet that. And when I talk to people at stores in Tennessee, or just this idea of they're out there fighting for our freedom, right? That's sacrosanct. That's what our troops are doing, and we support our troops. So I think it's not that different. And what's interesting too. When you look at the number of people who have been killed, and there's a Twitter feed by a guy named Rob Lee who posts images of soldiers who have been killed as they're on as they're in local newspapers in Russia. And I have a friend of mine who's from Buryatia, and so many of these troops who are being killed in the first wave are ethnic minorities: Buryats, Kalmyks, Tatars, people who are not ethnic Russians. And I think part of that is because most ethnic Russians who are generally better off get out of conscription. They're better. They're not fighting as much in the army. Just like in the U.S. or probably in most armies, people end up being soldiers. They're kind of lower class people with not the same number of possibilities.
And the Russian army is a conscript army, from what I understand.
Right.
It's not
Right. I mean, they have more professional. They've been trying to move to a contract army. And one of the many mysteries of the miscalculation was that If Putin thought that he was going to take Kiev right away, he should have put his best troops there and got there as quickly as he could, instead of moving all these conscripts in, not even telling them they were going to fight. And it really showed this combination of hubris, miscalculation, isolation, that botched this so badly for Putin at the beginning, and now they're moving to a plan B. And they're fortunate. Now they've obviously primed this, but they're fortunate that the Russian public support is still there, because it really has been a series of miscalculations.
Yeah, and I also want to raise, I guess, the comment you made about the Russian TV stations. Al Jazeera has a show called The Listening Post, and they showed a clip from Russia 1, the TV station, where Margarita Simonyan, who has been sanctioned by the West, basically said on the day of the Russian invasion, and this is the translation that comes across the ticker tape, "I have feelings close to euphoria, feelings that are hard for me to contain. Today it happened. It's true happiness." How prevalent do you think that view is in Russia?
I think it's there. I have a colleague of mine, Martin Geiger, who's a political scientist at Carleton. His closest friend lives in Moscow. The day of the invasion, he was in a state of despair, trying to think, like, can I stay in this country anymore? Wandered to work with not even thinking. Gets into work and people are popping champagne, waving the Russian flags. Like, yes, finally, we're going to get rid of this threat. These people who think that they have a right to exist as a nation, and a right to join the NATO and the EU if they feel they want to, and we're putting up with that. So I think there is that narrative, and like I said, I don't think that euphoria has lasted, which is interesting when you compare it to Crimea. And I think that's something that the body bags and the grinding nature of this campaign will halt. But I do think that this idea, Putin himself wrote about this, and many Russians feel this, Ukraine is a creation of Russia. To the extent that it exists because either Russia has allowed it to exist or even has fostered it outright. And it doesn't have any right to exist on its own. I think that's very prevalent in the Russian people. It's hard. Like, I got to say, I was surprised. It was one thing for the Russian troops to murder so many Chechen civilians and Syrian civilians when they could be othered so easily. Here, these Russian troops are murdering Slavs, right? Ukrainians, people who speak, many of them are ethnically, Ukrainian, Russian. Some are Ukrainian, some are Russian. Some speak Russian, some speak Ukrainian. But they're closely related peoples, obviously, and it doesn't seem to matter. And that's been the horrifying part, how easy it's been. And maybe when you think of Yugoslavia and the Serb and Croat issue, we shouldn't be shocked. But still, to me, I was hoping somewhere along the line, Russian soldiers and the Russian army would say, no, we're not going to do this. And that hasn't happened.
Yeah, and we there has been a lot of worldwide condemnation from other countries in the world, and I know that you had wanted to talk about this as well, that there have been other worldwide condemnation about the hypocrisy, because the world didn't pay attention when Muslims in Chechnya were being bombed, or really didn't pay a lot of attention when Syria was being leveled. But now that it is white Slavs being attacked, I'm certainly very seized by this issue, as are you. But I think a lot of other parts of the world are feeling like, why should we care when you didn't show us any empathy? Not you personally, of course, Jeff, but when you didn't show us any empathy when it was our turn. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think for people in the West and Western European countries, North America, we have this normative value to liberal democracy. And we think there's a certain expectation that we should defend liberal democracies, that it's a superior form of government, and that people who want to form them, therefore, should be supported to the hilt. Unlike, say, people in Syria and people in regimes where there's always been a hint of authoritarianism, and then you add the racial factor, and you add all these different political factors to it. And I think a lot of the world has understood this for a while, that there's a certain American hypocrisy, and Putin's tried to play on that in the past. And then he violates it. I mean, he complains that all the the Americans just march into Libya when they want. They march into Iraq. They take on this task of nation building, which of course he wanted to take on in Ukraine, but he's not talking about that too much now. And if you are in places like India, places like Brazil, first of all, now both those places have authoritarian populist leaders, Modi and Bolsonaro, who are
democratically elected, but nonetheless, yes, absolutely,
not likely to want to talk about this rule or the value of liberal democracy. And they also see other things that are going on. I mean, there's economic cost to all of this in terms of food, in terms of energy, and quite frankly, right, the Germans can talk all they want, the Europeans can talk all they want, and maybe we would be too if we didn't have enough oil. But they're still supplying $1 billion a day to Russia. Like $1 billion a day is going to Russia from Europe for oil and gas, which is funding that. So we could critique these countries like India and Brazil, but they don't see this as being any different from American invasion of Libya or Syria or Afghanistan or many other invasions that great powers invade. And I don't think that for them it's as big an issue. And Putin has done a good job at trying to say we need to challenge a unipolar world. And so China, India, Brazil, all of these countries, they're not going to stick their necks out. Not that they could do much anyways, but they don't really feel that they're that tied to supporting a Western coalition. And I don't think that's going to change.
And I think, Jeff, one of the people who made this comment was our current Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who said this is really a fight between authoritarianism and democracy. I feel that way because, like yourself, I've been working on democratization my whole career. However, it seemed apparent, and you raised the issue of sort of Western dependence on Russian oil, that in fact liberal democracies have been very comfortable trading with authoritarian governments for many years, certainly since the end of the Cold War. So are we sort of, invoking this dichotomy to make sure people choose a side, or is there a little bit of hypocrisy in that regard?
Yeah, I think both in a sense, right? Chrystia Freeland is making sure it's a clear black and white issue because she doesn't want to acknowledge a lot of these relationships that go on between authoritarian regimes. And you think of the U.S. Is so critical about trade with Russia. Oh, we can take oil and stop oil from Russia because they don't get very much. But when Khashoggi was murdered in Saudi Arabia, right, and this regime continues to be as oppressive, if not more oppressive than Russia, we just ignore that, right? So we're very selective in what we're ignoring and what we're not as Western countries. It is again because Russia did invade a democratic regime, and I agree with you in a sense that there is something that's very sad about a country like Ukraine, which has worked so hard to build a democratic state against all of these challenges.
With all the flaws, yes.
All the flaws,
absolutely.
From corruption to being stuck in this very uncomfortable neighborhood. And they've managed to pull off a relatively functioning state. And here they are all of a sudden at the threat of erasure. So it is very emotional, I think, for people like us who really do see a value in that. But it's sort of fun. Just as an aside, I have a Russian friend of mine. She's from Rostov, actually, who is a little bit ambivalent about this because she is a Russian patriot in the sense that we're Western patriots. And her view was, well, like, if I was a Ukrainian, would I rather die for my country, or would I just say, okay, well, maybe I should just live under an authoritarian state and just live normally, like we lived in the Soviet Union? Which I thought was sort of an interesting viewpoint from a very westernized Russian. They're saying, well, I don't support the invasion, but maybe we shouldn't be too value laden about what we think is worth fighting, we're laying down our lives for, and potentially, globalizing this with a country that has nuclear weapons. And then going back to Chrystia Freeland's statement, of course, the Russians are doing this too, right? They have also set this up as a war of Western superiority and the idea that the West wants to have this unipolar world that's liberal and that doesn't respect traditional cultures, that will rule over anything that it doesn't like, and Russia, which is kind of the bulwark of trying to prevent that. And the Russian Orthodox Church has been at the forefront of that. And Patriarch Kirill, at first he was a little bit ambivalent about the invasion because, of course, there are many Orthodox in Ukraine, too, that have a strong relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. But then he started talking about things like, well, Ukraine and the European Union, they allow gay pride parades and they allow this cultural degradation. We're standing up against that. So it's a cultural battle. It's an existential one. And my caller, Piotr Dukevich, who you know well, who's a Valdai member, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, he just said it in the aside during one of his talks. He just talked to some people in high military ranks in Russia, and he said they are convinced that a war between the West and Russia is inevitable at some point, because the West is never going to accept a Russia that does not kowtow to them. And this sort of strike first doctrine. I mean, Putin has already said that. He just said that a couple of days ago.
Absolutely.
Yesterday in Ukraine. Like, we knew this was coming, and so we better strike. And so I think this bipolar view is clear on both sides. I think it's frustrating for the Russians because they thought they could divide the West. They haven't done that. They've united it. But still, where we go from here is a real mystery because the military situation on the ground could very well lead to a very long, drawn-out war of attrition in eastern Ukraine with no clear sense that one country has the advantage over the other, and that's going to be hard.
Yeah, and right now there's sort of this reconfiguration going on, right? There was something on the New York Times podcast, The Daily, this morning about that, about the next few weeks being instrumental for Ukraine to survive as a nation, as the Russians go from 4 fronts of attack to essentially 1 front of attack.
Right. Yeah, and it's that Russians make mistakes in war. I can think of the Russo-Finnish War as one that sort of historically that they've made several mistakes in, and they regrouped and then did better afterwards. I'm sure they'll do somewhat better because it can't be worse than their initial strategies. But Ukraine has done an excellent job so far, both the level of morale, the level of strategic ability, and if the West can continue to get weapons to them, they have a good chance at really holding off the Russians. But neither regime will be able to achieve the goals that it wants. And this is why Zelensky is a wonderful wartime leader. I won't
absolutely
critique him at all, but he's scared, right? He's of a peace agreement. As much as he knows that peace needs to happen, that's what he's been saying. Well, if we hit any peace terms, I have to subject to a referendum. Because he knows that his rhetoric has conditioned Ukrainians to think that if he sort of says, okay, let's get it settled, we'll give up Crimea, we'll give up the Donbass, we'll give up the right to join NATO to just stop the conflict. He knows that if he does that, a lot of Ukrainians who have suffered and died are going to say, well, we could have just done that in the start and not had this war.
Right.
Whereas for Putin, it's the same kind of thing. If he doesn't win, if all he wins is some kind of half measure like that, that's when the knives, I think, will start coming out, because he knows that if he has never been subject to being a loser before to this extent, and he's never had to deal with that. So this is why I think these next few weeks are sort of critical, but it also could be that one side is going to have to really know they're going to lose. And I don't think both of these regimes are going to survive this conflict.
That's very, very frightening. Let's close with your sort of prognostication, if that's a word, for Putin. Where how do we get the end of Putin?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this is the last act in Putin's rule, and I think he realized that before. And I think the reason he went into Ukraine was he wanted this to be his legacy project. Before he left office, he wanted to settle the Ukraine question and ride off triumphantly and say, I've solved all of Russia's major immediate foreign policy problems, because he's failed in Ukraine time and time again. To the extent that he's lost, that's what he's lost. the poisoning of Yushchenko, the Orange Revolution, the coup in 2014. All of these times he's tried to bring influence to bear on Ukraine's law. So we thought,
no more Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah, that this was going to be the chance for him to do it, and now he's failed. So this will be his last act. But whether he'll be able to ride out at least somewhat triumphantly, or whether he'll be pushed out, I think that's an open question. But I think we're down to the last few years. That's my prognostication. Who knows? I'm just as likely to be wrong as not. But I would say we're down to the last few years of Putin. The question is where he goes out and how.
And it all comes back to our original discussion about public opinion, whether that makes any difference. Is this is likely to be a revolution from above, not a revolution from below? Does public opinion really matter? Or is this just about him upsetting the other people in the Siloviki and the security services?
I think public opinion can matter. It's more likely to be some kind of coup or some kind of palace revolt or something like that. But the form that these revolt might take and the aftermath might depend on public opinion. If public opinion remains very hawkish, very militaristic, the person who comes in to replace Putin may realize, I'm going to have to up the ante. I'm going to have to start using chemical weapons. I'm going to have to start really threatening nuclear war when the West is off balance. But if the public is very tired of the war and the sense that whatever happens to it, there'll be a number of potential contenders. If there are contenders who believe that they can mobilize public support for a more liberal democrat, maybe not liberal democratic regime, but a softer regime, I think then public opinion does matter in that case, because we're more likely now, if there was a coup tomorrow, that Putin would be replaced by someone who's more or less just like him.
Yeah, right.
So we'll have to see what happens, and that's where, if the coup comes simultaneous to the Russian public seeing all these bodies come back, as sort of this Afghanistan kind of mother's movement revives and things like that, you could see a Gorbachev type figure, say, for example, if we're to take that analogy forward, coming to power.
But you said someone like him, so that suggests to me somebody who, has a similar mindset, but it feels that Russia hasn't done enough to win the war, instead of sort of backing off and saying, you've really put us on the wrong track. You've turned us into a Stalinist regime rather than an authoritarian state. That's not what I'm hearing from you. I'm hearing similar people with similar mindsets coming in.
Yeah, I would say, the Siloviki, the people who are on the Security Council, this group that the military generally has not become involved traditionally in Russian politics, but it could be some Security Council person come in with more radical elements of the military. And we're going to see what this new general Dvornikov does now that they finally have an overall leader of this in Ukraine, and what their tolerance is there any bounds for tolerance for murdering civilians because this is not something I don't think professional military officers are comfortable doing. I think it's pretty clear when you look at the massacres in Bucha and Chernihiv that these orders came from the top, because you talk to the residents who were interviewed said the first week wasn't so bad, but all of a sudden there was this change, and people started being massacred. So there's a lot to play for in this, and a lot of different ways it could go if Putin is toppled, but it's just as likely it'll be someone either similar to him or on the right of him as it will be to someone on the left of him.
Yeah, amazing. Geoff, thank you so much for this. It's been a great interview, and not surprisingly, you had some great insights based on many years of working on these topics. So I really do appreciate it, and it was good to reconnect with you.
Thanks, Geoff. Thanks for doing this. I think it's important for us to play this out more than in sound bites, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Exactly. We've got about 35 minutes full, so that's that's awesome. Geoff Sahadeo is an assistant professor at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. Thanks again so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And that's our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced by Huge Impact Marketing. Please visit our YouTube page and subscribe so you can see future podcasts. I'm Geoff Dubrow. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care.